the August 17th meeting of the West Sacramento City Council Redevelopment Agency and Financing Authority. I'd like to begin tonight as we do each week with the Pledge of Allegiance. We'd like to invite our guests to join the council and staff in the pledge, which tonight's going to be led, because he's sneering, by Aaron Laurel. The council did not meet in closed session this evening, so we're going to proceed directly to our open session agenda, item 1A, which is presentations by the public on matters not on the agenda but within the jurisdiction of the City Council. Our microphones,
I think
I'm just not projecting. No, mine's on. I can keep my finger shut. Okay. So we're on item 1A, which is presentations by the public on matters not on the agenda, but within the jurisdiction of the City Council. As noted on our agenda, this is, we are prohibited from taking up items that are brought up under 1A, but it is an important opportunity for a public forum. We do ask that anyone wishing to address the council on this or any other item on tonight's agenda to please fill out one of the yellow cards that's available at the door and to turn it into the city clerk. In front of the city clerk is a timer that we use to make sure that everyone has the chance to be heard. And to that end, we ask that all comments be limited no more than 3 minutes. Also in front of the clerk is a flip chart that indicates which agenda item we're on at any moment. And we recognize that for some folks, speaking in public can create some anxiety, so we do ask that there not be any boos or catcalls or applause or other demonstrations, and that we maintain a civic discourse here in the chambers. So with that, we have no written request to speak on item 1A. Does anyone wish to address the council on this item? All right, and I'll just observe, and it's posted here, that as we get to the agenda items, that we take the speaker cards up to the conclusion of the staff report. All right, item 1B then is council communications. Are there any reports or other communications this evening?
start out.
Mayor Pro Tem Christoph.
Yes, the West Sacramento Flood JPA met last Thursday, and there's a couple items that are of significant interest that I think the council really needs to be briefed on. And one of them is the South River Road closure, where it is closed. The Corps has asked everybody to stop work. And so there is not going to be any work, in essence, continuing, and we have a road closure. Probably going to delay things. My thumbnail guess is about a year. And the issue was the high water and possible seepage. Personally, I feel that there are some remedies for that, but the Corps, being the Corps, has said what they have said, and they've taken this action. I think we have a meeting with, I think staff has a meeting with some Corps folks and maybe DWR tomorrow. Hopefully this issue gets brought up again, and I know staff and I know RD 900 Ken Roos, they've worked hard to see if there's some alternatives or some things that can be done. The Corps thinks that, and the contractor believes that they can button everything up and everything for this winter will be fine. But to continue to delay things it's just not healthy for us. And there's, in my opinion, I think it just escalates a little bit of risk. I don't think that, I think that the levee system there is pretty solid and wide and everything else. So I'm not really too concerned about flooding, but at the same time we've got some issues to correct there, and to let those issues linger on for another year, additional year is really not healthy. And then tomorrow there is a property owners meeting with our staff, and it pertains to the reach along the Sacramento River further south. It's a long reach over by Bees Lake and all of that. 3 draft proposals are being looked at. Each one of those could have some tweaking, but in each one of those proposals there are potential for, there certainly is going to be the taking of property and taking of some homes. And depending on what draft proposal is eventually deemed certifiable, it's going to be, it'll be an interesting time for us, because anytime you get into property acquisitions and things like that, it gets pretty difficult. But I think that the key in the whole situation is going to depend on a couple things. One of them is to make sure that it can be certifiable. It has to be able to be certifiable from the Corps, DWRs, from their perspective. And also the other part of that is there's potentially some financial gains as far as the city's concerned, depending on how much properties are taking for setback levies and that sort of thing. And one of the proposals it goes in fairly deep. We don't know what the state yet would offer, so to speak, but at the same time, it seems like they would be willing to pay much, much more of the work that needs to be done into the 90% bracket and that sort of thing. Whereas if you do the stand-in-place one, where you just do the slurry wall on the existing levee and that sort of thing, number one, we don't know if that is certifiable, if they'll really agree to all that. Number two, we don't know what would happen as far as the veg policy that the Corps has set out. Number three, what we would get for the states and contribution, we're not sure about that. I know that staff is working diligently in order to find as many answers to those questions as we can. But tomorrow night there is a meeting of the property owners and our staff, as I'd indicated earlier, and there should be a lively discussion, to say the least. And so I think that in some respects we'll all hear about it and all of that. And I certainly would like to make sure that staff gives us a report on, what's transpired, who said what, and because there's some folks out there that are going to be probably a little upset. But and this isn't the greatest time in the world from their perspective to sell their properties or do whatever they have to do. And so I do think it'll be just a pretty interesting time. So that took most of our time at our flood meeting.
Thanks. Yeah. All right, thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Christoph. Any other communications or reports? SACOG, tomorrow will be approving the city's Transit Development Act, Transportation Development Act allocations for transit for YOLO bus. And although we made a policy decision a couple years ago that we're directing all of those funds to YOLO bus operations, essentially to transit, I wanted to report. So we're essentially acting as a pass-through now. It's this is a claim for the last 2 years plus the current year that we're in. I'm sorry, that last year plus the current year that we're in, and also ADA operations and paratransit. It's just over $1.7 million for those purposes. That leaves a balance in our share, which we'd be carrying over to next year, because we don't have, we still don't have a good long-term sustainable source for the level of transit that we have projected. So every time that we can, we try to carry some of that funding forward. So that'll be approved. And then, so our carryover for fiscal year 12-13 would be about just over $1 million. All right, there's nothing further. Item 1C is appointments to boards and commissions. I think I said last meeting that we would do the port commission tonight, but we have actual adoption of the ordinance tonight first, so we'll do it at the next meeting. That brings us to the consent agenda, which is items 2, 3, and 4. Any item to be removed or any item for separate question or comment? Okay, it's been moved by Mr. Villegas and seconded by Mr. Johannesson. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, that motion carries unanimously. Item 5 is a public hearing in consideration of Resolution 11-63, an abandonment of public right-of-way at the Halyard Drive cul-de-sac.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and council members. The subject of the public hearing is the abandonment of a portion of the right-of-way located at the Halyard Drive cul-de-sac. By way of background, the Highway 50 Harbor Boulevard Interchange Project eliminated the Halyard Drive Harbor Boulevard intersection in order to accommodate the eastbound Highway 50 off-ramp. The north end of Halyard Drive was converted into a cul-de-sac, which created an uneconomic remnant of bare land about 1,500 square feet in size. The bare land has no particular public benefit and presents a maintenance cost to the city. With the goal of having the property maintained and reducing city cost, staff would like to assemble this remnant with the adjacent city-owned property, which is the former Baker Square restaurant, with the intention that the remnant would be landscaped by the future buyer of the restaurant property. The city will retain a public utility easement over the entire remnant and a public right-of-way for the existing sidewalk that crosses the remnant. The proposed abandonment was noticed and posted per the requirements of the Streets and Highway Code. That concludes the presentation. I'll be glad to answer any questions about this.
Questions for staff at this time? Mr. Villegas?
Just a brief question. So the intent is to just landscape it, or would they use it for parking, or what's the intent?
No, it's not big enough for anything but some
That's
planting to make it more attractive. And at this time, it's not part of any landscaped area, and it's bifurcated and segmented by Caltrans property, other properties, and the sidewalk.
Yes. Okay. All right. Thanks.
There's a motel that is right there at that, I think it's Ramada Inn or something like that.
Yes.
Did they want it?
They're interested in the property to the north, the former Monty Murphy property,
Oh.
to maybe construct some parking there. That property is in the Caltrans, California Transportation Commission disposition process. It was
Oh, so
part of the,
that property will come from Caltrans.
it will, that was a contribution by the city to the interchange project.
All right, then we're going to open the public hearing on item 5. We have no request to speak, but because it is a public hearing, does anyone wish to address the council on this item? They're dying to leave? No, they're not. There is 2 members of the public here, and they get a chance, so. All right, seeing none, we're going to close the public hearing on item 5, return to the council for any further questions or discussion, or for a motion. No, and to adopt the resolutions. Okay, it's been moved by Mr. Johannesson and seconded by Mr. Villegas. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, that motion carries. The item is adopted. Item 6 is a public hearing in consideration of Resolution 11-38, a resolution of the City Council of the City of West Sacramento declaring an abandonment of a public right-of-way located at a section of South River Road at the intersection of the future Bridge and Riverfront Streets, and authorizing the city manager to facilitate the transfer of abandoned portions of South River Road in the Bridge District to the adjacent property. Ms. Yancey?
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and council members. The resolution before you does 2 items. It facilitates the full potential development for the properties that are along Bridge Street, the proposed Bridge Street, which is now South River Road, and allows those properties to meet the frontage standards that are outlined in the Bridge District specific plan. The resolution allows for the abandonment to occur and then would give certain authorities to the city manager to enter into a purchase and sale agreement with Union Pacific to acquire reversionary rights that are associated with that right-of-way easement that's on South River Road, and would allow for then the city manager to transfer those properties to the adjacent property owners so they could build out their blocks. It would also allow for the city manager to purchase a UP track easement, which currently goes over the Mill and Garden Universal Streets that connect to the waterfront. We accepted those public access easements subject to those track rights, and we're just looking to resolve those per the Smart Growth Investors Development Agreement. That concludes my presentation. I'm available to answer any questions.
Any questions this time? Seeing none, we'll open the public hearing on item 6. Does anyone wish to address the council on this item? We have no slips. Seeing none, we'll close the public hearing. Return to the council for any further questions or discussion.
Mayor, I'd move that we adopt resolution 11-38, abandoning .32 acres of public right-of-way located along the section of South River Road and the intersection of the future bridge and Riverfront Streets, and authorize city manager to facilitate transfer of abandoned portions of South River Road in the Bridge District to adjacent property owners, and instruct the city clerk to submit this resolution of abandonment into escrow upon discretion of the city manager.
All right, it's been moved by Mayor Pro Tem Christoph and seconded by Mr. Villegas. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, that motion carries. Item 7 is a public hearing and consideration of Resolution 11-1, abandoning a public right-of-way located at a section of South River Road at Tower Bridge Gateway.
Good evening again. This resolution was something that we were going to bring to the council in January of this year, and we postponed that resolution. You saw the intent to abandon in December of 2010. This facilitates the Tower Bridge Gateway alignment that was adopted in February 2009, and this would be abandoning the portion of South River Road that's adjacent to the Whaley property that the city owns, and a portion of Tower Bridge Gateway that is covered by the former Y track that the agency is in possession of and that the city has an option agreement for. By abandoning this right-of-way, it would facilitate a consolidated development site that the city could be in possession of if it chose to exercise that option, of about 1.4 acres. And that's about 45% of what that block, that development site, that block is. That's about 45% of the entitlements that are on that block as well. It would be accessed from the ballpark, Riverview, Universal Street, which has been constructed in a modified form by Parker Landscaping using the Prop 50 grant funds that were done to develop the Riverwalk Park. So this abandonment would facilitate the development of that site and would encourage the consolidation of that site, either by the city or potentially by the adjacent property owner. That concludes my presentation. I'm available to answer any questions.
Are there any questions at this time?
I do.
Mayor Pro Tem Christoph.
I do have one. Now,
Yes.
this is a fairly large piece.
Yes, it is.
So is there value in this then? Is this something that we can sell, or is it something that we can negotiate for future development? Because the site is so large compared to the other ones we were talking about earlier.
The abandonment certainly enhances the value of this property. It would not be developable with this right-of-way easement over it.
Is there any interest from various property owners to acquire this property so that they can consolidate with existing properties?
I believe so.
Yes. The council will remember that back in December, when we brought this to you, the resolution of intent to abandon, we were in discussions with the Ramoses who own adjacent property. We had an exclusive negotiating agreement. We ultimately were not able to reach a satisfactory conclusion to that, but we are continuing to have discussions with them, and the city manager and I have continued conversations with both Ramos family and their attorney, and so we are continuing to work towards ultimately consolidation of the property in some fashion. But we're not at a point now to take any action on that, but as Katie's indicated, the abandonment will only enhance the value of the property, so ultimately, however it's developed, the abandonment is a necessary step to that.
Was this property purchased with redevelopment funds?
Portion of it was, and you'll recall back in, now I'm trying to remember, in June, early June, the city received, or city acquired an option from the agency to purchase the property. And that's the method by which the agency's share would be transferred to the city if the city ultimately decides to exercise that option.
So is this property then subject to this redevelopment fiasco that we're in? And it may go to, it may be decided by other people?
We hope that we have taken steps to ensure that there is an enforceable obligation. by which the agency can acquire the property. I think that, you know, the idea would be that the city obviously isn't going to develop it, and so back in June, the concept was, by the city acquiring an option, the city could either exercise the option or potentially transfer the option to another party, private party for development. That's the long-term plan. You know, everything is up in the air right now, obviously, with the legislation and the court stay of the legislation, so.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Johannesson.
Yeah, Katie, the parcel that we're talking about is the shaded parcel on the first diagram, isn't it? It's 1.1 or so acres.
That's correct.
Now, that parcel in and of itself is not really a developable parcel, is it? I mean, can anything be put on something like it? It's kind of an odd shape and.
If it was consolidated with the Whaley remnant, it would meet the minimum depth requirements as required by the zoning.
And what could be put on there, for example, with a lot of that size?
I'm sorry, I'm not an architect. I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly what be able to go there. I can tell you that it does meet all the minimum requirements as required by the zoning, and it would have access off of Ballpark, Universal Street, and potentially access off of Tower Bridge Gateway. So it does meet the minimum requirements for a development site, and it is entitled. Development there would be consistent with the supplemental EIR that was adopted.
Okay. Now, one of the comments in the staff report is basically that this abandonment would have the abandonment of the right-of-way would have no fiscal impact on the city. Now, my understanding is there could be issues with egress and ingress into one of the parcels that's adjacent to that, and that there could be potential issues with that could very well have a financial impact on the city.
I'll let Jeff address any of the fiscal impacts that have to do with any pending litigation. What I can address is the planning history that's associated with this, so to provide a foundation for what Jeff will articulate. The 1993 Triangle Specific Plan does talk about access being relocated to the east, as it was done in the 2009 Triangle, Tower Bridge Gateway realignment. So that we've carried that consistent idea that access would be limited at that site from the 1993 specific plan. The general plan that was adopted and revised in 2000 addresses this realignment and the potential of access being changed at that site when we acquired SR 275 and looked at doing the degrading of that freeway off-ramp. So there's been several opportunities where we've looked at addressing access, and when we adopted the 2009 Bridge District Specific Plan, we created this new concept, this universal street, which is multimodal in nature, which is designed to provide access to that site. We also mentioned that it's possible that we could study looking at access off of Tower Bridge Gateway, sort of a right-out access. We did not study that as part of the update to the Bridge District Specific Plan, because that's more of a project level, and we were dealing with a program level redesign. And I'll let Jeff answer any other questions related to the litigation.
Yes, at the time the E&A was entered into with the Ramoses, you're aware that there was contention on their part that the abandonment of South River Road affected the access to their property. The city's position on that has been that the universal street that's going in provides equal or superior access given the limitations on the use of the existing South River Road or the then existing South River Road. You know, this is probably not the place to resolve that issue. I believe there is still a dispute. The Ramoses still believe that there's an effect on access. That's part of the reason why we were having negotiations with them or discussions with them about transfer the property in the first place. So we will continue those discussions. I'm reasonably comfortable that access is still provided, and with the universal street, access will be equal to or superior to the rights that they had. But Mr. Leviach is here representing the Ramoses, and I'm sure he has a different opinion if you'd like to hear his side on it.
Okay, all right, thanks.
All right, then with that, we'll open the public hearing on this item. And if Gary, you just said his last name, and now I can't.
Not the first. It's Leviach. Thank you.
Leviach, okay,
Thank
welcome.
you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. Gary Leviach, I'm a lawyer for the Ramos interests with Desmond Nolan Leviach in Cunningham in Sacramento. Practice practice eminent domain law and inverse condemnation law. I'd like to correct a couple of things in the staff report, first of all. There is a mention in the staff report on this item that the city sent out letters in December indicating intent to abandon, and to date, no agencies have objected to the abandonment. This includes the Ramos Trusts, who did not object to the abandonment. That is incorrect. On December 15th, when this matter first came up to you, the Ramoses delivered a letter to the city that says, this letter serves as our notice to the city of West Sacramento that as owners of property adjacent to the public right-of-way along South River Road at Tower Bridge Gateway, we strongly object to the city's proposal to abandon the city's right-of-way for the public street. And the reason that they do so strongly object is because they abut that street and they have abutters' rights, property rights that are unique to those owners, different from the rights of the public. They have a right of ingress and egress to their property and the right to go to the next intersecting street in both directions. That's, those abutters' rights have been recognized by the California Supreme Court almost 70 years ago. If you abandon South River Road, you are going to destroy the Ramoses' property rights. The universal street, I've heard, the city's position is that it creates equal or superior access. This is simply not so. The universal street is a lesser street. It is intermodal, as I've heard, but essentially it's walking friendly. There are vehicle traffic allowed or going to be allowed, but it's a dead end. What it does is it puts the Ramos property on a dead-end street, the end of a dead-end street, not abutting one of the major streets in town where they had full turning access in the before condition, right in, right out, left in, left out, in two locations, not to mention what was down by the bridge. These rights are protected by the California Constitution, Article 1, Section 19. That property cannot be taken without just compensation being paid. In addition to that, in California, the legislature recognized long ago that an inverse condemnation type of actions to level the playing field, if a landowner is successful, they're also entitled to litigation expenses, which include all expert witness fees and reasonable attorney's fees. So that's the second part of the staff report that I disagree with, that there's no fiscal impact. There is potentially significant fiscal impact to abandoning this road and destroying the access rights of the abutting owners, the Ramoses.
Time's expired.
If I could just have a minute. Mayor?
I can give you another sentence or two, but
Another sentence or two?
But we have...
We're basically
strict time
pushed
limits.
up against the wall now. The abandonment starts the clock to run, the statute of limitations begins to run. We are working with staff trying to come to an agreement. So far, we haven't made any progress. But in the next 30 to 60 days, if we don't, we're going to be required to file a lawsuit to protect our rights.
All right, thank you. All right, that's the only request we had on this item, so we're going to close the public hearing and return it to the council. Do you have anything further, Ms. Yancey?
No, I don't.
Other members of the council? Let me say and be very clear. We have spent, what, $29 million to make this property developable by removing the rail line. We've created access. We've built the riverfront trail, the grid system. From day one, the property owners have been a part of this. I will not be part of a cooperative agreement where there's a disagreement, there's threats of litigation. We are either partners in this process or we are not. And I am deeply offended at this approach. Given the substantial amount of public investment that has already been made and is contemplated, this is the place where we are making more investment of public resources to make this property developable, your property developable, than anywhere else in our city. And it is unconscionable that the property owner would come forward with this approach. So I'm absolutely not persuaded. We are making substantial investments to make this property more valuable, and this is not the way that partners who have worked from day one on this in every level of detail. This land use plan has been thoroughly vetted and has been part of that process. It is not a surprise to anyone, and no one building on this property would want us to leave this road in place and to not do all the development infrastructure work that we have been doing. It is all to the benefit of this property. And so if we are going to be in an adversarial position it is a game changer. So please, as you're reviewing your provisions of the Constitution and sending us threatening letters, please convey that to your client as well, that a partnership is a partnership. And we've at no point threatened to sue when we've had disagreements and try to recover attorney's fees and all of that. We don't have, this development project will work only if every public and private dollar we use is for the value of the property. And every penny that we're going to spend suing each other over this makes it that much less likely that we will not achieve our joint vision, our mutual vision for what this property and the whole Bridge District should be about. So I know the city manager's been working on this, on negotiations, and I appreciate that. But for me personally, the amount of public and investment that we have made in this project we cannot proceed day to day on a basis that it's all about litigation positions. It cannot be. We're all taking too many risks together to make this project successful. On the core of it, we've had a development proposal for this before. It's fully entitled because we had proposals for a variety of projects on a smaller parcel than this, right at that location. At one point, we had a restaurant proposal from the Periguri Group on this on this site. So I think, it is not just an unusable remnant. I appreciate that Ms. Yancey's not an architect, but we've had prior proposals for smaller uses of this site, and this does add value to it. So I think this is a perfectly reasonable proposal and approach. It's quite obvious to anybody who's there now at how the riverfront and this district and the adjacent properties are enhanced by what is already a closed road, and the changes that are occurring as a result of the project that's being built with the full cooperation and collaboration of the property owners in that district. And we need to be going full steam ahead, not threatening one another. Mr. Johannesson?
Yeah, I'd just like to encourage the staff to continue to work out something that's fair for all parties involved to help nurture that partnership, I think, that the mayor's alluding to. And also to look at this parcel in the grand scheme of things. I wouldn't want to see this developed into something that's outside of our vision. This whole area right here, I think, is pretty prime to the Bridge District and how that's going to be developing up in the densities that we want. Even though there may be entitlement on a fragment of this property, I'm sure that the development that goes there wouldn't be what we would want if the parcels are consolidated and something grander was put on it. So I would encourage staff to continue the work and try to work out a solution that's fair.
Any further comments? Discussion? Mr. Villegas?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So, Mr. City Manager, given the public testimony this evening, has anything changed relative to the staff's report and recommendation?
No, I think that this is tangential in many respects. It clearly is related in the context of the concern about right-of-way and access. But we don't believe it's useful to maintain a public right-of-way when the roadway is being removed at this very moment.
Mayor Pro Tem Christoph.
So what you're saying is no matter what, the roadway is going to be gone.
Yes, I believe
it doesn't do any good to,
if we
continue with a quote-unquote South River Road on that little tiny section.
No, it would come from nowhere and go to nowhere.
Right, exactly, right. Okay.
Worse than a bridge to nowhere.
Anything further?
A lot of bridges to nowhere
A lot
later.
of bridges to nowhere. Mr. Villegas?
Mr. Mayor, I would move that recommend the council adopt Resolution 11-1, abandoning a public right-of-way located along section of South River Road, Tower Bridge, gateway located west and southwest of the Tower Bridge.
It's been moved by Mr. Villegas and seconded by Mr. Johannesson. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none. That motion carries. Item 8 is consideration of adoption of a biennial capital improvement budget and 5-year capital improvement program. Ms. Pasco.
This is a follow-up to the workshop that was held on June 1st. Your staff report highlights the changes that have occurred since then. And that's really the focus of the staff report and the presentation tonight too. In addition to the council direction that we received about specific projects and funding policies, the biggest change that has been incorporated is relative to redevelopment. Since June 1st, the actions of the legislature and the governor have affected what we can do for capital reserves and what we can do for certain projects funded by redevelopment. The project most affected is West Capitol Avenue. We had previously proposed funding that at over $4.5 million, and tonight the revised version shows a budget of $1 million for that. And even that amount puts the redevelopment fund into deficit. So if we wanted to achieve a zero balance at the end of this budget year, we'd need to reduce that further by another $400,000. The recommendation of the Executive Budget Committee was that any surplus that we had available in the most flexible of our funds, those that can be used for a variety of purposes, be applied to long-term debt in the general fund and create a reserve there. I have a very brief slideshow that sort of gives the overall picture, big picture of the budget. On this first slide, the larger numbers, larger in size, not just in dollar value, are showing what the current proposal in front of you is, and the smaller figures show the difference between that and what was presented in June. So the fund balance went down a bit, our projected revenues went up a bit, non-CIP commitments went down a little bit, our remaining authorization, meaning we actually was up a little bit, so we spent less money in 2011 than we thought than we had projected that we might. Our new budget requests declined by about $4 million. That's roughly in proportion to the amount of redevelopment funds we had to reduce. And the projected balance at the end of this biennial budget period is up by $2 million. Next slide. This shows what our remaining budget authorization. So this is our carryover from at the beginning of this fiscal year. So as of June 30th, July 1st, these were the active projects and the previously approved budget amounts that we still had left to expend. So this is our carryover of about $156 million. And as you can see, most of that is in the flood program and in the bridge district. This slide is sort of a similar graphic about what the current proposed budget is. So we are adding roughly $20 million to the budget with the project requests that you have in front of you. Again, the biggest projects are flood and the bridge district and port, and the balance are distributed as shown. So my final slide is really about the future and the long-term plan. So looking out beyond the biennial budget period into the 5-year capital improvement program. The black area has grown since what you saw in June because this identifies unknown sources of funding for all the projects that we've identified. And we had to do, in order to keep the volume of projects sort of in the same range in the $150 to $200 million overall capital program. So that's why this is flat, roughly, over those 3 periods. With relatively with flat revenues from utilities, from impact fees, and from redevelopment, and then declining money in port grants. You see that we've got our black zone, our unknown funding, unfunded projects grows larger over time. So I can answer any questions about specific projects or the recommendations that you have, but that's the end of my presentation.
All right, are there questions from Maureen? Mr. Johannesson.
Yeah, Maureen, just a quick one on the streetcar on the 5-year budget. So are we pushing any of that funding out another year? Or is this, I'm looking at the attachment 3, first page, Measure V, which is that new fund that was set up with the sales tax revenue? Or
Right.
Yeah. So is that what that's reflecting, that we're pushing that off a year, or?
I actually have several sources for streetcar built into the budget. So in addition to Measure V, I'm also showing it in Fund 292, where we're presuming that we'll have either redevelopment funds or something that will replace or substitute for tax increment funding in the later years. And then I think we had also assumed some federal grant funding.
Okay, so it looks like we're still on track then, roughly.
Well, we're on track for the roughly the amount of money that I projected the city of West Sacramento to be contributing to a larger streetcar program, which was on the order of $10 million.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Pro Tem Christoph.
Yeah, following that same line, what could possibly replace tax increment?
Well, if redevelopment does die or the city does not
Right.
choose to opt in, then the property tax revenue, the way that it is redistributed, the city will get a share of that. And it will go into the city's general fund. And as I had presented in the June workshop, I had about 5 or 6 ways to look at funding the capital program into the future. And one of the suggestions was to establish a capital reserve for capital projects within the general fund. So there will be some added revenue from property taxes if redevelopment is no longer doing that.
Okay. But that money goes into general fund.
Correct.
I guess what's going to be very interesting, from what we hear nationally and as far as budgets go and all of these other things, if these kinds of projects are still going to be viable. And if they're not, I want to make sure that those general fund monies are general fund monies, and it doesn't mean that we could just do a standalone project, because I don't think that the city has the wherewithal to put a standalone project together like that. And especially in light of Measure B, because I think next year, half of that quarter will go into two different funds. One's for levies and the other one's for streetcar. Well, I just want to make sure that if streetcar's not going to be viable, and I don't have a crystal ball, I mean, I'm certainly hoping that it is, and I know the mayor's been working hard, and you know, all of these things have been going on, but if it is not viable, then those monies can be allocated to other kinds of things, or should be anyway.
You know, that will be the council's discretion. You'll have the opportunity to consider this again. You know, we anticipate bringing you annual updates on the capital program, and every other year we'll be re-examining the budget and the next 5-year plan.
So are we taking any of those dollars now and putting them into, we'll say, a bank or into something that would identify only those dollars going into those two particular funds?
Well, right now, what you have in front of you, on the first page of attachment 3, it identifies that what we're programming for the last 3 years of this capital program, that when the Measure V revenues start flowing in 2013, they'll be dedicated to streetcar and to flood program.
All right.
So what's not in the staff report is a table that shows what the fund sources are, which is a challenge because so much of it is unknown. And so, like, I can tell from the narrative in the staff report, on I Street Bridge, for example, says it's programmed in 2013-14, but no identified source of funds. And but you can't tell that on a consistent basis across the projects. And the challenge is, if we want, for just accountability purposes, we come back and say, well, why aren't we building this project that we budgeted? And you say, well, there was never any funding source identified for that, so you can't really hold us accountable. I need to know that. Like, which projects are like real, which projects are, we have a good imagination about. And it's hard to distinguish those in this.
All the projects that are in the first 2 years, the
Right.
biennial budget, those are real, that's real money, they're really budgeted, they're really authorized for spending, or your action in approving this will authorize them for spending. The projects that are in the latter 3 years, the capital improvement program, are a plan, they are not a budget. They are identifying projects, they are identifying appropriate amounts of money, and in some cases they're constrained, both by sort of keeping the overall budget in a size comparable to what we've been doing over the last several years, and keeping the overall amount being spent each year comparable with what we're able to build, to deliver through the pipeline. So, given those constraints and given the priorities that the council has identified, we've recommended or identified the amount of funding needed for various projects. I could provide the detail about how much of this I think is real and not, but I can tell you in general that the fund in which a particular project is placed will give you a lot of that information. So, for example, the General Facilities Fund is funded from the general fund, and we've kept the size of that pretty consistent. So that's fairly real if it's in the General Facilities Fund. The Redevelopment Fund 292, I've pointed out that that's, and what the assumptions that we've made about that are that there will be some measure of funding, and that we have constrained that to include only those projects that are included in the 5-year implementation plan. All of the impact fee funded projects are really tenuous, because I have assumed pretty much flat revenues for all of the impact fees. So that includes traffic impact, some like the courtyard, and some water and sewer related things. The rate revenue for the utilities, those are all very real. With your recent action in approving the adjusted rates for water and sewer services, the 5-year plan, the capital improvement program, is consistent with what was outlined in those rates. So those are quite real. The flood and the port programs are real.
It's helpful. It just would be on a project basis. I mean, because I use this document, I think legitimately to hold myself accountable when I respond to constituents. They say, well, when are you going to build this? And I can say, for some projects, we're going to build this in 2014-15. But I want to temper how committed I'm being on behalf of the city. But I also need to just know when we come back here to say, you told us that we were going to do this. And so it's hard to assess that from just the information that we have. And we've at prior times we've had too much information, I know as well. But this, I think, it needs that connection. So we're able to get a sense of both how real it is or not question, but what the basic assumptions are. So if the assumptions here are the projects that are in the impact fee categories assume some amount of growth, and I would want to know what we're assuming in terms of that, so that I can at least make that adjustment as well. So it's not a challenge to any of the projects. It's just in terms of what we're for the program, what it is that we know about them. On this other question, cities across the country that don't have redevelopment do capital projects, and so I don't think we can say if redevelopment goes away, we're just not going to build projects anymore, and we're going to do general fund operating costs. We've got to figure that out. We haven't had to we have the reserve policies and all of that, but we haven't had to have a really robust sort of Christmas club sort of approach where we put some money away every year for significant capital expenditures. We would in a post-redevelopment world, and so I know one of the areas of the city manager is thinking about, that we're all going to think about, as what that looks like. How we develop a meaningful, robust, reliable, certain way to save money essentially for for capital projects in the long run. Because we can't, I mean, our infrastructure is still gonna require that over time. Mr. Villegas?
That's perfect. So Marie, you know what also would be helpful, I think, at least for me, unless it's in here somewhere and I'm missing it, is in addition to identifying the source of the funding, the percentage, because I know that if somebody were to pick this up and look at under the Fund 208 General Facilities, I know you're not intending to mean that $500,000, or certainly not $1.5 million over the course of 3 years for the Sacramento River crossings would cover the cost. So I know at one point we either had something in the capital plan or in the general budget about the percentage of, maybe it was in the Measure K, J and K plan, where it was a percentage identified in terms of what does that get us? Because sometimes it's confusing. I mean, it's easy to mistake in these numbers for actually completing a project when in fact it's just a certain percentage. It's the front work that needs to happen, and so it would be helpful if there was some indicators in addition to the fund source that tells us what that gets us, at least for the 5-year plan.
I think what we've had before, it's been a long time since we had this, but was I'm not sure if it was a percentage or it was an indicator. Is this planning,
Cost.
working drawings, construction,
That's what it was.
equipment, or
That's what it was. Under the notes.
Right. So you wouldn't necessarily know this is 40%, but you would know that this is we're in construct, it's just planning, so
Sure.
don't adjust your expectations.
Right, and maybe under the notes, I mean, not to create extra work, but under the notes, you've already got something that kind of goes down that path a little bit, but maybe just a little more detail, because it's easy to get confused about what it is you're buying for that amount of money.
Okay.
Thanks.
Mayor Pro Tem Christoph.
Maureen, in Fund 292, it says redevelopment bonds, and 1112 is $1,000,003, 1314's 4.2, so forth.
Mhm.
If the agencies go away, what happens with that fund?
I imagine that, we'd be creating some other, a different fund for major capital projects that are for pursuing infrastructure improvements in areas within, that have been lacking. I'm looking for euphemisms for redevelopment project area. That what I would anticipate is that what this city has spent redevelopment money on in the past is primarily infrastructure. And we will continue to have needs for financing and building capital improvements and infrastructure in the areas that are targeted for development. And so I would anticipate that, the council and city management will be establishing a fund for that purpose.
So since this is under capital improvement plan, there's really no money allocated for it. But, I mean, there's no money for it. But at the same time, these are, in essence, the costs that you think we will need, or the monies that we will need to generate in order to continue to move forward with some of the plans.
That's a good way to look at the capital improvement program. It's identifying the monies that we need to be able to, go out, find, and pin down in order to pursue these projects.
Okay.
So you gave us a supplemental memo this
Yes.
evening about the changes with respect to the Washington specific plan and parking improvements. So I understand. So we can augment an existing project,
Correct.
but we can't create a new project?
That's correct. And even the augmentation is using funds that were previously budgeted. So we're not increasing the overall size of the redevelopment budget. We're essentially just moving funds around among previously approved projects. So because of the legislature and the governor's action, everything that existed before January 1st of 2011, that's what we need to work within, those bounds.
And is a transportation management plan for Washington, is that the highest and best option we've got
Well,
among the?
Our objective, what we had identified was a real need to update the Washington specific plan in order to better serve the kind of development that we anticipate, and essentially undertake the same kind of exercise that we did for the Bridge District in adopting a new plan and updating the environmental review on that. the best fit for those purposes is within that Washington parking improvements, because a comprehensive transportation management plan includes supportive land uses. So if you're, if your aim of a transportation management plan is to reduce reliance on automobiles and to encourage alternative modes of transportation and to reduce vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas emissions, all of that is very closely related to land uses. So that seemed like the best fit. A transportation-related, an existing project that was very much transportation-related. One of our objectives is to reduce the demand for parking within the Washington area, and consequently reduce the need to supply structured parking within that. And that's very closely related to the land uses.
Okay, and the streetscape phase 2, if we, is this dependent, is there $1 million project to be had if we didn't receive any additional grants?
No, and nor was there a $4.5 million project to be had. That was the amount that we had budgeted previously. We've identified 2 possible projects for this phase, and they're priced at 8.9 or 8.5 and $12 million. The $8.5 million project gets to Poplar, from Jefferson to Poplar. The $12 million project gets us to and through Sycamore, including the circle at Sycamore. And so our intent in budgeting local funds for the project was, to provide that local match for outside funding and to make it more fundable. The more we had, the more attractive it was for funding agencies.
And then what if we don't get those external grants for that project? What happens with whatever is left in the
Well,
redevelopment?
ultimately, the council could choose to redirect those funds to another
But only
project.
within an existing project?
Correct.
Of which, and are there other existing projects other than streetcar design phase 2 and Fifth and C cleanup, or?
You have, all of the redevelopment funded projects in 292 would be eligible, so, what you have on the list in front of you.
In
and then,
292 in the CIP or the budget?
the longer list is in your attachment 3.
But
That's
all
the
of
more
those would
comprehensive
be-
list.
all of those-
Any of those. And then I would need to clarify this with the city attorney, but there are other projects not housed in Fund 292 that have received redevelopment funding. I'm not sure if they'd be inclusive, or if they would be available also.
Well, the reality is we're in fairly uncharted waters. What we've given is advice that we think certainly is, in our view, consistent with what we understand the spirit to be, where agency funds have been transferred to the city for CIP purposes, and that transfer occurred prior to January 1 of this year. We're reasonably comfortable that those funds can be moved around to finance other CIP projects that have also been previously identified, provided they meet a basic redevelopment purpose. So if they're happening within the project area or support the project area. So we can talk about other areas they might be able to go, but the sort of bright line that we're trying to maintain is not moving it into new projects that were identified this year or in subsequent years, and not adding obviously additional funds.
So if the agency doesn't exist anymore, and we end up not getting the grant resource we need to do that project, then how and who would reallocate that money to some other agency project?
Well, the position that we're taking is the money has been transferred to the city for use as part of the CIP for projects that were identified back when there was no restriction on, other than redevelopment law, there were no restrictions on the use of agency funds. And so, as long as we stay true to that concept, that was money previously allocated for projects that had previously been approved, then we're reasonably comfortable we can move it around.
One more.
Mayor Pro Tem Christoph.
Maureen, on that $1 million, as far as West Cat streetscape, I thought I read someplace in here where you wanted to, that there was $400,000 that would be available for that, other than the $1 million. 400,000 would get us to where?
The 400,000 is, what I have shown here on the budget is $1 million.
But that
but
would
there's-
be, we'd have to be successful in some grant applications.
No, what I assumed is that, that there might be some other savings from other projects available. It puts the redevelopment fund into deficit. To budget $1 million
Right.
for, West Capitol Avenue puts it in deficit. If you wanted to avoid that deficit and just show a zero balance for redevelopment, then we would have to reduce the budget for West Capitol Avenue.
Well, to me, that makes sense to do that, unless I'm missing something from a budgetary, from a way we budget. I mean, I'm missing something. Uh-oh. Here it comes.
You know, there's a few cases in the, if you look on your attachment to the sort of summary of funds, there's a few cases where funds have temporary or minor deficits, and we're making those up by loans from other funds. And in the case of redevelopment, what we're anticipating is that there will be some budget savings from other projects that are completed. So we would have, for example, I think the Broadwick Boat Ramp was one where that project is completed and there's some savings that might be available for reallocating.
And you're doing it this way to maximize our grant competitiveness?
Yes.
So you can show on the application that we have
$1 million.
budgeted $1 million?
Correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
But yet, at the same time, I mean, I don't want to get into a situation where we've got to reimburse the state X number of dollars, whatever it may be. Okay.
No, you know, in the worst case scenario, we'd be filling that deficit, that $386,000, from one of the other more flexible funds, like, for example, either Fund 108 General Facilities or the Ziggurat Parking Fund, 225, where there's a surplus. Very flexible money, we could just dedicate it to that purpose,
All right. Okay.
with council's approval.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. So the request is that we adopt both the biennial budget and the program. Oh, Mr. Villegas.
Yeah, I'll make a motion as soon as but I just wanted to make sure I understood. Maureen, on page 1 of 8 in the staff report, under the road fund, the signal timing, $175,000 for the
Yes.
current fiscal year. Is that citywide, or what is that intended?
It's for a couple of particular road segments on Harbor Boulevard and Jefferson Boulevard, and they're both related to recently completed capital projects have really triggered the need to do some signal timing. So the new interchange, the interchange improvements at Harbor have really created a need to do some, add some hardware, and do some signal coordination between Evergreen and Industrial. And on Jefferson, the completion of the West Capitol Avenue improvements have created some backups at Merkley and south to Park Boulevard, which need to get coordinated with the Caltrans interchange and their signal operations. And again, and most of the money that that is requested is going into hardware in order to coordinate those signals.
Great, thank you.
All right, so seeing no further discussion, is there a motion on item 8?
Move adoption of the biennial capital improvement budget for fiscal year 11-12, 12-13, and the 5-year capital improvement plan.
I'll second it.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Item 9 is consideration of approval of an enforceable obligation payment schedule. And we have a supplemental document on this at our desks as well. Mr. Robinson?
Evening. As you mentioned, the purpose of this report is to request approval of an enforceable obligation payment schedule pursuant to Assembly Bill X-126. I was going to mention, you also mentioned it, the corrections that were at the dais. We also have copies of those available for the public if they're interested. And then I also wanted to mention that we are requesting that the recommendation be modified slightly to include your authorization to make minor adjustments to individual line items contained in the EOPS. What I'd like to do is just give a quick background on the recommendation that we're making, and then make myself and staff available to answer any questions that you might have. In June, the governor signed Assembly Bill X-126 and 27, which together eliminated redevelopment agencies and created a mechanism for cities and counties that wish to continue with their redevelopment programs to do so through a voluntary alternative redevelopment program, provided they're able to make specified payments to the state of California. The state has calculated those payments that would be due in order to participate in the VARP. For West Sacramento, that amount would be approximately $6.5 million for fiscal year 2011-2012, with annual payments starting in fiscal year 12-13 at $1.5 million that would be adjusted annually thereafter based on property tax flows. In response, the City Council adopted ordinances 11.8 and 11.9, which signaled the Council's intent to opt into the VARP, but it's not clear at this time whether the city and agency are going to be able to assemble the funds that are necessary to make the requisite payment to the state. Adding additional uncertainty is the fact that a lawsuit has been filed challenging the constitutionality of both redevelopment laws. The Supreme Court of the state of California has issued a stay that essentially froze large portions of the two redevelopment bills, but not including the component that covers the action that we're requesting tonight. Given the uncertainties that are out there, staff's recommending a two-track approach whereby the city continues its efforts to identify the funds to opt into the VARP, but at the same time, the city and the redevelopment agency take the actions that are necessary to comply with the provisions of ABX 126 that cover jurisdictions that do not intend to opt into the new redevelopment model. The recommended action tonight is designed to position the city to be in compliance with ABX 126 in the event that the council determines it can't participate in the alternative redevelopment program, or in the instance that the alternative redevelopment legislation is found to be unconstitutional, but the legislation eliminating redevelopment is allowed to stand. The EOPS is essentially an interim spending plan for the successor agency, which would be the city, as it winds down the redevelopment agency's affairs. And pursuant to ABX 126, the EOPS will be replaced by a recognized obligation payment schedule, or ROPS, upon the formation of an oversight board. So this is essentially an interim document that would bridge between now and the adoption of an ROPS. And both of those documents, the purpose of them is to define the obligations that the successor agency can continue to pay as it winds down the redevelopment agency's affairs. The EOPS does not commit the agency or the council to opting in to the VARP or not opting in. Staff will be bringing a workshop and a request for direction to the council in September on that point. But the objective tonight is to preserve the clearest authority possible to continue spending money after August 28th, which is the deadline in Assembly Bill X-126 for the adoption of an EOPS. That's essentially the end of my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about the schedule. And we also have staff from the Finance and Community Development Departments if you have specific questions about the schedules in your attachment.
So there's a schedule, but everything's in August, all the payments?
I'm sorry?
All the payments are in August for everything, or the schedule that's
Right.
in the attachment, which is by month, but the 100% of everything's in August. How does that?
That's largely true, and that's largely to maximize our flexibility. It means that we could do it in August, or we can do it subsequently if it's reflected there. But if it's not reflected in August, we couldn't do it until it is reflected.
Until the
Yeah.
month arrives that it is
Right.
It would be December, right?
Well, actually, it could be any month. We took a shot initially at putting things where we thought we would need to make the expenditures, and then we realized that there may be need to make them before that. And so rather than doing that, we really moved everything back so that we could make them from August forward. There are a few examples where we know we have debt service payments or other things later on that they show at a later date.
So there's just over $1 million for West Cap Streetscape 2 on this schedule. Is that the same $1 million that Maureen was just describing?
Yes.
Okay, so, and I thought what you said, Jeff, was that, or the city attorney said that the city had the money, and so that we would be able to make that determination later.
Right, you're looking at the page that is it should mirror the CIP. It's a little bit of belt and suspenders. We're identifying it as the CIP. We have a theory that the money has been transferred and the city has control over it. On the other hand, because of the way the legislation is written, if somebody doesn't see it that same way and you don't have it listed on your EOPS, and you're not authorized to make the expenditure. It's difficult to say whether the answer ought to be in for a penny, in for a pound. Let's keep it on the CIP and take it out of the EOPS altogether. That hasn't been the advice, I think, from the city's finance consultant, who worked with CRA to develop their reform. His recommendation, I think, is to include it on this as well.
So does this amount of $3.1 million does that put the redevelopment fund in deficit? Or how does that relate to the last item where we couldn't fully account for the $1 million yet? How does it line up with this action?
Go ahead, Paul.
I think we'll let Paul help us here.
Mayor, the amount that we're showing here on the EOPS is based on a budget projection. The actual revenues may not line up and be available as they're shown here. We wanted to err on the high side by showing the numbers because again, we have to have something on the list and we have to have a number if we want to actually expend the funds. In actuality, let's say we don't get savings from West Cap Phase 1, there may not be funds available, let's say in Phase 2 to spend, and we wouldn't spend it. But if we don't at least show the capacity, to spend it in the future on the schedule, then we can't. So, and all these are budget projections. They don't represent actually what will happen if we don't, let's say, realize savings from a project or have some other source of redevelopment funds that's allocated to that.
Yeah. This is beyond my ability to comprehend, but close though. Close enough to see that it's all right. I just don't quite get how it doesn't all fit together.
So, Jeff, how does the current Supreme Court stay affect the October 1 date?
The portion of AB 26 that was stayed was the dissolution portion. That's what Part 1.85, the October 1 date is in 1.85. So that date is stayed.
Okay.
So agencies throughout the state are suspended. If the stay has not been lifted by October 1, they will not be dissolved. However, one of the open questions from the stay is if the stay is lifted, what happens? And in fact, today the Supreme Court modified its stay a little bit. One of the modifications was to ask to have the parties brief the issue of what is the effect of this stay, and does it extend the statutory dates?
So they're asking what the effect of their stay is.
Yes.
Interesting.
Essentially, they're asking the parties to brief the issue of what the effect of the stay is.
I'm not totally crazy to ask that question. They're asking themselves the very same way. Okay.
I'm sure they have their own opinions. They just want to hear what we think too.
All right. Great. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Christoph.
Yeah. John, on this supplemental thing that you just gave us, go to page 3-12. Let's just take the first one on there, the county administration fee.
Just randomly.
Just random. It was number one. Outstanding debt obligations, $11 million. And then total due during the fiscal year is $344,000, whatever. And so August 11th, we would have to pay $17,000 something dollars. This is what this says?
I'm gonna ask Paul to come up and assist me again with that one.
Yeah, Councilmember, the issue is yes. If pass-throughs continue, which we believe they will, that payment would be based on, we get property tax in 3 allotments per year, and we pay our fees to the county as each allotment comes in. So that would represent just a portion of the total due during the year, and we always paid at that time in August when that last property tax payment comes to the agency.
So if we don't have an agency, what's going to happen to the December payment of $172,000?
Right now, our financial consultant, the same one who prepared this form for CRA, has notified us of 2 conflicting parts of the legislation. One appears to say that pass-through payments will remain and continue for the life of the redevelopment plan, even after redevelopment's dissolved.
How are you going to generate it if our ability for tax increment in future is hampered?
Well, good question. The county auditor controller is going to continue to track what would have been tax increment, as strange as that sounds, and they'll continue to calculate the pass-through payments that would have gone through the entities had redevelopment not been dissolved.
Okay. Okay.
There's none?
I'm afraid to make that motion.
Why? All the department directors seem to have, like they acted this out at their last meeting. How's this gonna play out at this council meeting?
They're flipping coins, see who's got to go up first.
Okay.
All right, Mayor Pro Tem Christoph.
Yeah.
Motion. Thank you.
I'm going to ask for further clarification in one of our meetings, Toby, but I'm going to go ahead and support this. Staff respectfully recommends that the agency approve the enforcement obligation payment schedule, which includes attachment 1 to the staff report, and authorize the executive director or his designee to make minor technical modifications to the EOPS.
And to make the line item revisions, minor line item revisions as was indicated in John's beginning presentation as a modification to the recommendation. All right? It's been moved by Mayor Pro Tem Christoph and seconded by Mr. Villegas. No further discussion. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none. Motion carries. Item 10 is presentation and first reading of ordinance 11-10 and consideration of resolution of intention 11-65 to approve an amendment to the contract between the Board of Administration for CalPERS and the City of West Sacramento. Mr. Wright.
Good evening, Mayor Baldwin and members of the council. Hopefully this will be a little bit more simple and straightforward than the last presentation. As you probably remember, staff has recently negotiated a side letter agreement with the POA for a new second-tier retirement formula for all of the police safety members. That has been ratified by the police union and adopted by the council. Provides for a new 3% at 55 with a three-year formula for total compensation versus our current 3% at 50 and a single highest year. Because the city had previously accepted the cost-sharing agreement under the government code with CalPERS, and because this new second tier will change that cost-sharing amount for both existing and future employees, we have to do a contract amendment with PERS. So in order to do a contract amendment with PERS, we need to have a resolution of an intent to do that contract, notifying the public of the costs of the amendment, and then an ordinance authorizing the city to amend the contract. And that is the request of staff tonight. I can answer any questions.
I don't understand that either. Mr. Johansson?
Yeah, Phil, how does this put us in comparison with the region in terms of the benefits for other safety employees?
It's a mix. Most other agencies are adopting a second tier, probably, and this is a guesstimate, probably in the 60% range or the 3% at 55 with the 3 highest years, and probably 40% are going for the 2% at 50 with the 3 highest years. We're talking about 6 or 7 agencies that I know, and 3 or 4 have done one, and 2 or 3 have done the other.
In the 2% at 50 and 3% at 55, the difference isn't all that great.
Correct. Our actuary's report that we reviewed, staff reviewed, didn't show a very significant difference between the 3% at 55 with the 3 highest years and the 2% at 50 with the 3 highest years.
Thanks.
Other questions or comments?
Just one last comment, Mayor. Assuming this gets through, just so that you're aware that the Human Resources Department will then have to do a secret ballot election with the police safety members because of the change from the 4.5 that they're currently paying to the 4.325. Anytime there's a change to the benefit, even though it's to the positive for the current employees, PERS requires, and I apologize that I'm telling you this now, but they told us this 2 weeks ago for the first time, even though I was there in person twice, asking them, give me every step of the process. So it does get a little, we have one more step, but if that happens, then we'll be back in September for the second reading of the ordinance. So that's just the process.
All right. Seeing no further discussion, Mr. Johannesson?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I'd like to move the recommended action.
All right, it's been moved by Mr. Johannesson and seconded by Mr. Villegas. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. Council calendar.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, this is our last meeting for the month of August, and we won't be meeting again until after Labor Day on September 7th. And I just wanted to remind everybody that the farmers market will continue on Thursday nights through September.
All right, questions on the calendar? City manager report?
A couple items. I wanted to expand a bit on Mayor Pro Tem Kristoff's comments on the flood program. I'll reiterate that there is a meeting tomorrow night. It'll be in the Recreation Center at 6 o'clock. It's intended for those property owners that are immediately adjacent to the Reach B of the Southport levee program. And just to indicate that even though there are substantial impacts on some of the alternatives, at this stage, no alternative has been selected. And that maybe wasn't as clear for some of the people who were in attendance at the WASAFCA meeting. I think there was maybe a sense that we were already leaning toward a particular solution. We have not made any kind of determination in that way. But it is clear that alternatives do have effects on some of the existing houses. In fact, most of the alternatives have affect some. Some affect virtually all. But so that we do expect it to be possibly a little bit troublesome. So we've structured that meeting so that there's ample opportunity for information sharing, and there'll be virtually individual counseling for the property owners in terms of explaining the real estate and the process and the flood protection strategies. So I think that we've done what we can to disseminate this information. This is premature in some respects because we haven't come to any kind of recommended proposal, but we didn't feel it was appropriate to wait any longer. There's substantial interest in the community in getting this information out, and so we've taken this step to do that. Also, I wanted to comment on the setback levy. We did have a technical conversation today and determined that our best course would be to come on the regular Corps of Engineers meeting in September. They have a technical review committee meeting. We'll request that this item be on the schedule because I think appropriately Mayor Pro Tem Kristoff had asked, is there anything the city can do to move that project along, because it does represent a detriment to the community in terms of circulation, if nothing more. The best thing we could come up with was shine some light on it, and we think that by requesting an agenda item on the subject, it will get the attention of the Colonel, and we will perhaps get an earlier resolution of that issue. I did also want to expand on what we intend to bring